The causes of the 1980 to 1982 recession were only four reasons. You had high oil prices, you had an intentionally and artificially created super hyper federal funds interest rate to contract the money supply to combat double-digit inflation. 21.5% was the federal funds rate instituted by Paul Volcker during the entirety of the 1980 to 1982 recession. There was no more 100% full employment. That's bad for workers' wages and benefits. So after the Volcker recession, we'll never go back to 100% full employment. That is not the goal anymore. We're okay with 5% of the people looking for work not finding work. And then number four, Ronald Reagan. He comes in like a tour de force. He comes in with all these economic programs and economic ideas. He says economics, so, steakonomics, reconomics, screechonomics. So Ronald Reagan's got these screechonomics, right? He's going to run an $80 billion deficit, so, fantastic conservative there. At the end of the recession, he's going to raise corporate taxes, just to give him a little bit of credit. But overall, he's got two major tax cuts in the early 80s for the wealthy. And then he's also going to have two big bank deregulation bills, one in 1982, one in 1980. Yeah, July 1982, one in 1980. So Ronald Reagan passes two bank deregulation bills. He has, the shock doctrine comes along with Reagan. It comes along with Reagan. So he's deregulating the banks, and he's doing tax cuts for the wealthy. He's increasing the war spending. So he keeps saying government's too big and spending too much, but when it comes to war spending in the military, he spends a shit ton of money on the military, at the same time cutting taxes and, cutting welfare and the programs that people need in order to live and to grow. 6,000 businesses are going to fail during the 1980-1982 recession. And I think Ronald Reagan's just undeniable to, say that his economic policies, it had something to do with something. So to deny it of any force whatsoever, I think would be doing a disservice to even, Reaganistas. So Ronald Reagan fires the air traffic controllers on August 5th, 1981, right at the very beginning, right in the middle of this recession. 17,000 air traffic controllers are on strike by executive action in the name of national security. So by executive order, this signals to the unions and worker class there's no hope. You got income inequality, poor education, racism. A lot of the, AIDS, 1980, you saw AIDS come in. So you have a lot of the same problems that we have today. 14% poverty rate in 81, 15% in 82. We got 12% poverty rate 2018. So apparently we're okay with 10 to 15% of our people being impoverished. So Ronald Reagan, just like Herbert Hoover in 1929 and Martin Van Buren in 1837, if you got a douchebag for a president, they're all about government is the problem. They're all laissez-faire, free market, non-government intervention is purist. Even the Republicans today believe in Keynesian economics, that you can use the government to stimulate the economy. Even Republicans believe that today. So Martin Van Buren didn't believe it. Herbert Hoover didn't believe it. Ronald Reagan, government is the problem, right? So they're all about just let the visible hand of the free market, let the greed of, all the wealthy, just let the greed of a nation, guide our economy, our economic system. So that was just real, quick, basically. High oil prices, the Iranian Revolution, there was a 73 panic to 76 recession. So the high oil prices, it's kind of ironic that high oil prices is going to cause, a recession in the early 80s when today oil is just dirt-ass cheap. It's negative $40 a barrel. They'll give you $40 if you take, 40-gallon barrel off their hands. So we have, it's either we have too high oil prices or our oil prices are too low. And we're like Goldilocks. We want, our oil prices to be just right, perfect. Here it is. Deliver now, sell now, use it now. Don't have any surplus. Don't have a shortage. Just, keep steady stream. Just keep it moving. Keep it going. Nobody argues about Paul Volcker and his high federal funds rate being a major cause. It was intentionally created. So the Ronald Reagan and Jimmy Carter and Paul Volcker of 1980 to 1982 was okay with 11% unemployment for the general population, 20% for black folks, 20% for West Virginia. So they're okay with millions of Americans losing their jobs and savings and loans, all those banks and businesses collapsing. So I want to mention this too. So it's kind of hard to determine when exactly, specifically a recession is whenever there's a downturn, whenever there's a decline in GDP for 2 quarters. That's specifically what a recession is. And so therefore the recession only lasted until, the end of 1982. But you're going to have a crisis throughout the 1980s. You're going to bail out some, 1984, there's a bank that the government bails out for $4.5 billion, which is cheap back in those days, right? But it was expensive back in those, but cheap compared to today. Only $4.5 billion. Here you go. That's, no problem. No problem. So, but then another bank had also failed too. So the S&L crisis, okay? So before you had banks and credit unions, you used to have savings and loans. There used to be savings and loans. It's a wonderful life. It looked like they were all over the place. And the point of a savings and loan, it's a depository institution, so it's a bank. But the point of a savings and loan bank is specifically to get the American people into home ownership. Over 1,000 savings and loan banks failed in the 1980s, 1,043 out of 3,234. The savings and loan crisis is going to last the entirety of the 1980s. It's going to end in 1989 when a Financial Reform Act is passed. But for the entirety of the night, so you had 2-3 year recession in the very beginning, and you have a lot of problems going on. Economic inequality is going to take off. This is when wages stagnate and the rich get, filthy rich. If you look at the charts, this is when, the American working man loses and continues to lose up until present day. Meanwhile, the wealthy continue to make record-breaking profits. So the 1982, the unemployment is 11%. 11%, that's worse than the Great Recession. And before, let's see, this is going to be the highest, though, since the 1929 Great Depression. So 11%, they're freaking out. 11% is high, but apparently we're a little pampered because the Great Recession, didn't even go up to 11%. And this was, the worst since the Great Depression, since 1929. So for 50 years, unemployment had stayed below 11%, real low. Full unemployment was the goal of the day, full unemployment. We don't do it anymore, but it's good for workers, wages, benefits, conditions. It gives working class people leverage if you have full employment. That's why the capitalists say it's 5% is fine. It's okay to have 5%. So like I said before, West Virginia had 20% jobless rates. So savings and loan crisis. The entire 80s, over 1,000 savings and loan banks failed. And so these banks are dedicated to getting the American people into their own homes. But they don't have the freedom to invest wildly on Wall Street and, some of the other shit that commercial banks have. And so they can't compete. They can't compete. You have 4,590 state and federally chartered savings and loan institutions with total assets of $616 billion. From 1979, they began losing money because of spiraling interest rates. 1979, right? This is the Volcker recession, the Volcker interest rate, the Volcker federal funds interest rate. So the net savings and loan income had totaled $781 million profit in the 1980s. But then they're going to lose $4.6 billion in 1981. Then they're going to lose $4.1 billion in 1982. So they made, $800 million in 1980, but then they lost $5 billion. Then they lost $4 billion in the next 2 years. Tangible net worth, the tangible net worth of the entire savings and loan program was zero. They had no assets. They had no value, no worth. So between 1980 and 1983, 118 savings and loans banks with $43 billion worth of assets failed. 493 voluntary mergers happened. 259 forced mergers of savings and loans banks were overseen by the agency. 1982, 415 savings and loans were bankrupt and insolvent. So the money multiplier effect, too much credit to risky deadbeats, not being able to compete, sunk the whole shebang. They had the deregulation acts, right? The banks so the savings and loans, they were free to do as they wanted, free to do as they chose. So I think this is interesting because even though the recession ends technically in 1982, you're going to have economic problems throughout the 1980s. There might have been 1 or 2% economic growth. If they ever got any economic growth, I'm sure they would just throw the biggest ass parties ever for themselves. So it wasn't a boom, right? But it's, they're gaining, so therefore they're not losing. So it's hard to tell for me because the savings and loan crisis is going to last the entire 80s, but the recession's only the first 2 years. So what year was 83 a good year, 84 a bad year, 85 good, 86? And so it just seems like a lot of bad shit's happened in the 1980s. Could you say the whole 1980s was crap? I don't know if you can go that far yet. Okay, so prior to the 2008 Great Recession, the 1980 recession was the worst economic downturn since 1929. And so the Great Recession was a worse downturn, but there was actually a higher unemployment rate in the 1980 recession, 1980 to 1982, higher than the 2008 Great Recession. The panic of 1980, 1981, 82, the housing and the steel and the manufacturing industries, the automobile industry, they all experienced a downturn. Housing, steel, manufacturing, automobile. Some of the most dramatic improvements were in industries hit hardest by the recession. So after the recession, they're going to evolve, and they're going to get stronger. Paper and forest products, rubber, airlines, and auto industry, they're going to up their game and really, do a better job at customer service. In the middle of 1982, you had 42 banks that failed. That's the highest since the Great Depression. Milton Friedman, he said that the 1929 Great Depression that lasted for 12 years didn't happen because of the New York Stock Exchange dip on Black Thursday. That little dip, it wasn't a crash, it was a dip. But they say, crash. No, but it's not. Milton Friedman says the reason we had the Great Depression were two main reasons. All those banks were failing, and the Federal Reserve was contracting monetary policy. So they weren't lending freely. They weren't trying to go for liquidity. They're doing the opposite of what we do today. But back in 1980s, they were raising interest rates, just like they did to the Great Depression. So it didn't happen. The banks were all failing too. So it wasn't just the Fed interest rates, the Fed, raising interest rates when people are getting hurt the most, which makes me think of this saying about banks. Banks will give you an umbrella when when the sun is out, the banks will give you an umbrella, and then they'll take the umbrella away as soon as it starts to rain. So we make sure banks are always succeeding, but they don't give a fuck. If we're doing good and well, yeah, they're our best friend, but as soon as we got a trouble spot, they'll dump us like yesterday's cheese. The FDIC spent $870 million to purchase bad loans in an effort to keep various banks afloat. $870 million the FDIC had to spend. 42 banks are closed in 1982. 1983, January, the approval rating for Ronald Reagan was 35%. 1983, 50 banks are going to fail. The FDIC said 540 banks were problem banks on the verge of failure. So it was the massive bank failures that happened in the early 1930s. That's what caused the Great Depression. Not the big dip, but, the high federal interest rate, and all those damn banks were failing. It wasn't just 1 or 2 banks. It wasn't a stock market crash and then people panicked for 12 years. It's the banks kept on failing. So the banks were failing. The savings and loan industry's failing, right? Left and right all over the place. So technically there's economic growth in 1983, low inflation, but you got a high unemployment rate. So again, high oil prices, which is the Iranian Revolution. They just doubled their oil prices. So incredible. High oil prices can sink the economy. Low oil prices can sink the economy. But also an intentionally and artificially created super hyper federal funds interest rate to contract the money supply to combat double-digit inflation, 21.5% federal funds rate, instituted by Paul Volcker during the entirety of the recession. And also we got away from 100% full employment and Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan was an economic tour de force. Like him or don't like him, love him or hate him, doesn't matter. His economic plans and ideas are, people are going to have to look into them and say whether or not they worked or did not work. But he did a lot of things, right? Tax cuts, bank deregulations, fire and air traffic controllers, letting some banks fail, rescuing other banks, the shock doctrine, capitalism, crisis capitalism, and the shock doctrine of Naomi Klein came along with the presidency of Ronald Reagan, probably the presidency of Donald Trump too. So we have a long history of laissez-faire, free market, non-government intervention purist, right? Ronald Reagan says government is the problem. Everybody lost their shit. Now everybody says government's the problem, but government has always been the problem when it came to the markets, the economic system. They didn't want government doing shit. Reduce the barriers to trade. Don't have taxes. Don't have tariffs. Low taxes. No tariffs. Low barriers to trade. Greater exports. Supply and demand. So Reagan says that this, recession is the worst economic mess since the Great Depression. Laissez-faire is a French term which means let it be. Just let the market be. Let the greedy assholes, sons of bitches, let the greedy carnivorous predators do as the fuck as they please. That's our American capitalist system right there. Ronald Reagan is a tour de force. So you have to, Ronald Reagan has to take credit for all the good and all the bad. He did pass a corporate tax increase at the end, which could have helped. 1982 midterms, you're going to see the Democrats gain 26 seats in the House of Representatives, which was the most for any party in any election since the Watergate year of 1974. But the net balance of power in the Senate was unchanged. Penn Square Bank failed January 1982. Ronald Reagan let it fail. Continental Illinois National Bank and Trust Company was about to fail in July 1984, but the government gives them $4.5 billion rescue package. A loan. A nice big fat bailout. So yeah, the Volcker recession, it's undeniable. The Volcker recession, the Volcker recession, the Volcker recession, the Volcker federal funds rate. Paul Volcker, he did it. It's his fault, but also there's a continuity between Volcker and the end of Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter picked Paul Volcker and the beginning of Ronald Reagan. So I think it's, nobody disputes it. 21.5% federal funds rate. This raised unemployment to 11%. Inflation was up to 15%. So, yeah, they lowered inflation. Unemployment went through the roof. So they're making the economy scream, just like they did in Chile. So we're going to make the economy scream and get a 21.5% federal funds rate, raising interest rates of all kinds to contract the money supply, to fight inflation, right? Inflation is public enemy number one. So I probably should write that too, high inflation. But the federal funds rate, the reason why they had it was to fight high inflation. But anyways, those are the 4 reasons. No more 100% full unemployment, high oil prices, intentionally artificially created super high for federal funds interest rate to contract the money supply to combat double-digit inflation, and Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan's economics. Reaganomics also played contributed to the 1980 to 1982 recession. I'm John Masters, 9:27 a.m., Saturday, April 25th, 2020, straight out of Louvetti, Southern Colorado. Peace!